leaned close as we walked through the parking garage and said quietly, like it was a favor he was doing me, "Just let me handle the talking tonight. These people have known each other for years. Don't try too hard." I didn't say anything back. I adjusted the strap of my bag and kept walking. That was the night I realized something had shifted in me. Not cracked, not broken. Shifted. Like a foundation settling. I'd been hearing variations of that sentence for almost 2 years, and somewhere along the way I had started to believe that silence was the same thing as peace. It wasn't. My name is Rachel, and I'm a 32-year-old structural engineer based in Chicago. I work for a mid-sized firm that handles commercial projects, hospitals, university buildings, the occasional mixed-use development that takes 3 years longer than anyone planned. I don't talk about work much at parties. Not because I'm embarrassed by it, but because most people's eyes glaze over the moment I say the word load-bearing, and I've learned to read the room. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was then. His name was Brett. He was a regional sales director for a medical device company. Good-looking in that easy, forgettable way. The kind of man who always knew what to order at a restaurant and made waitstaff feel like they were auditioning for something. He had a gift for walking into rooms and making people feel chosen. I thought, for a long time, that being chosen by him meant something. We met at a friend's birthday party. He asked me what I did, I told him, and he laughed and said, "So you're basically the person who makes sure buildings don't fall on people." I said yes, basically. He seemed genuinely charmed by that. I held on to that version of him longer than I should have. We got married after 2 years of dating. I was 29. The wedding was in Wisconsin, near where my mom grew up, in October, with the trees orange and the air sharp. It was a beautiful day. I remember thinking, this is the beginning of the best part. What I didn't understand yet was how slow erosion works. It doesn't announce itself. Nobody says, "I'm going to spend the next 2 years quietly convincing you that you're less impressive than you think." It happens in small moments. A raised eyebrow when you tell a story at dinner. A pivot in conversation when you start talking about your job. The way he'd introduce me at his company events. "This is Rachel, she works in engineering," said with the same energy you'd say, "This is Rachel, she's between jobs right now." I kept telling myself it wasn't intentional. He was proud of his work. His world was sales and relationships and quarterly numbers. And of course he lit up in those contexts. I was just different. We were just different. That's what I kept saying. But then there were the comments. Small ones, delivered gently, like gifts. "You don't have to explain the technical stuff, babe. People don't really care about that. Maybe let me introduce you next time. I know how to work a room. You're so smart, but you don't always come across that way at first. It's okay, I'll help." I want to be clear about something because I think this is the part people don't understand from the outside. I wasn't weak. I wasn't naive. I was a woman who had passed her PE exam on the first attempt, who had managed a $40 million hospital renovation project at 27, who regularly sat in rooms with contractors twice her age and held her ground on load calculations. I was not a person who doubted herself professionally, but loved as something different to you. It finds the seams. And Brett had found mine. The event was a fundraiser gala for a children's hospital expansion, the kind of thing that happens in a hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago, where tables cost $1,500 a seat, and everyone is wearing something that required alterations. Brett had been angling to get closer to one of the hospital's senior VPs, a man named Mr. Aldridge, who had significant pull in deciding which medical device vendors made the approved list. This was, in Brett's words, the most important networking night of the year. He spent 3 days preparing, researched Aldridge's background, practiced talking points in the bathroom mirror, bought a new suit. He told me which conversations to stay out of, which people were his contacts, and that if anyone asked what I did, to keep it brief because it doesn't really fit the vibe of the room. I remember standing in front of our bathroom mirror in my black dress. A simple one, knee-length, not trying to make a statement, and thinking I helped design the oncology wing of this hospital, not as in I was adjacent to the project. I was the structural lead on the renovation. I had spent 14 months on that job. I knew the floor loading specs for every room in that building. I had been on site at 6 in the morning in January to walk the steel erection with the ironworkers. That hospital was, in a very real and technical sense, partly mine. Brett didn't know that. I had told him I was working on a hospital project downtown when it was happening, and he had nodded and moved on. He never asked which hospital. He never asked what my role was. I had stopped offering details because the offers kept landing flat, and at some point you stop holding things out when nobody reaches for them. I put on my earrings. I picked up my bag. I didn't say a word about any of it. The ballroom was exactly what you'd expect. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces that cost more than my first car, a silent auction along one wall with items that included a fly fishing trip to Montana and a wine cellar consultation. There was a string quartet in the corner, the kind of event where everyone is performing their own ease. Brett found Aldridge's table within 10 minutes of arriving. I followed, smiling, present in that careful way I had learned, close enough to be seen, far enough not to interrupt. Brett launched into his pitch, dressed up his conversation. I stood slightly behind him and watched the room. That's when I saw her. A woman in her 60s, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing a deep green blazer over black trousers, no gown, which already made her stand out. She was moving through the room with that specific kind of unhurried certainty that belongs to people who don't need anything from anyone in the room. She had a lanyard tucked into her jacket pocket, which meant she was staff, not a donor. She looked at me, not the vague party room look-through. She actually looked at me, and then she tilted her head slightly, and then she started walking toward us. Her name was Dr. Okafor. She was the chief of surgery at the hospital, and I would find out later, the person who had championed the oncology wing renovation from the beginning. She had been in every major project meeting. I had presented structural updates to her team on 4 separate occasions. She walked up to me, past Brett, past Aldridge, directly to me, and put her hand out and said, "I thought that was you. I'm so glad you're here tonight." I shook her hand. "It's wonderful to see you, Dr. Okafor. We were just talking about the wing last week," she said. "The new unit opened in February, and the feedback from the clinical staff has been remarkable. The way your team handled the floor vibration issue on the surgical suite, that fix was elegant. I've been telling people about it." I said thank you. I meant it completely. She turned to the table, to Aldridge, to Brett, who was standing very still. "This is the structural engineer who led our oncology renovation," she said with the simple ease of someone stating a fact everyone should already know. "We had one of the more complicated retrofits I've seen in 20 years of hospital work, and her team made it look straightforward. That building is going to serve patients well for decades." I don't know exactly what Brett's face did in that moment. I know what I felt when I looked at him, which was not triumph. It was something quieter, something like finally. The conversation that followed was not mine alone. Aldridge asked genuine questions. Dr. Okafor filled in context. I was too modest to offer. Another woman at the table, a foundation board member who had helped fund the renovation, said she had heard the project cited at a conference in Boston as a model for retrofitting active clinical spaces. I hadn't known that. I stood there absorbing it, trying to hold it steadily. Brett said very little. He laughed once, at something that wasn't particularly funny, the way people do when they're buying time. At some point Aldridge looked at him and said pleasantly, "How do you two know each other?" Brett said. "She's my wife. Not I'm her husband. She's my wife." Like a claim being staked belatedly on territory that turned out to matter. I didn't react to that either. I kept my attention on Dr. Matter, Okafor, who was describing what the ward looked like now with the light and the wide corridors. I had designed those corridors to be wide enough for 2 gurneys to pass without contact. I knew that. I had fought for those 18 extra inches in a value engineering meeting when the contractor wanted to cut costs. 18 inches. It mattered. We stayed at that table for almost 40 minutes. When Brett and I finally moved away, he was quiet for a long stretch. Then he said, "You should have told me." I asked what he meant. That you worked on this hospital, that these people knew you. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "You never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't said it to be cruel. It was just the truth, delivered as plainly as I could manage. We drove home mostly in silence. You put on a podcast about 10 minutes in, which I think was easier than talking. I looked out the window at the city moving past, and felt something releasing in my chest, slowly, like a pressure valve finally being opened. The months that followed were not clean or dramatic. I want to be honest about that, because I've noticed that stories about marriages ending tend to skip the part where it's just long and exhausting and nobody is completely sure they're making the right call. We tried therapy, a woman in Lincoln Park with a calm office and a sound machine outside the door. Brett was articulate in those sessions. He always was. He knew the vocabulary. He could talk about his patterns with a fluency that sounded like insight. What I eventually understood was that being able to name a behavior is not the same as changing it. He could describe exactly what he did and why it was harmful, and then do a version of it the following week, slightly refined. I don't think he was malicious. I think he genuinely believed most of the time that he was helping. That managing me was a form of love, that shaping how I presented myself to the world was a kind of protection, not a kind of control. I think he had been doing it so long he couldn't tell the difference. But I could, and once I could see it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I moved out in September. We had a condo on the north side that we'd bought together 3 years into the marriage. I took my clothes, my drafting supplies, the coffee table I'd had since grad school, and the dog, a 7-year-old beagle mix named Clover, who had always, despite Brett's best efforts at wooing her, been primarily my dog. The divorce was straightforward, legally. We didn't have children. We split the condo proceeds. I took less than I was probably entitled to because I wanted the process to be over rather than perfect, and I don't regret that. Sometimes clean costs something. I decided it was worth it. There's a thing people ask when they hear a version of this story. They ask, why didn't you just tell him? About the hospital, about the project, about all of it. Why did you go to that gala knowing and not say anything? It's a fair question. I've thought about it a lot. Part of it, I think, was exhaustion. I had spent 2 years offering things and watching them go unreceived, and I had stopped having energy for it. Part of it was that I hadn't fully processed consciously how much his dismissal had cost me. When you're inside something, the shape of it is hard to see, but part of it, and this is the part I'm least comfortable admitting but think is most important, was that I knew. Some part of me knew that the hospital gala was going to surface the truth without me having to fight for it, and I chose to let it happen that way. I chose to stand quietly and let reality do the talking instead of me. I'm not sure if that was wisdom or avoidance, probably some of both. What I can say is that in the moment, when Dr. Okafor walked toward me across that ballroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not vindication, something before that. Something like, I still know who I am. That had gotten quieter over the years. Not gone, but quieter. And I had let it get that way, which is the part I'd spent the most time sitting with. I am telling you this from my apartment in Wicker Park, which has high ceilings and a kitchen that I renovated myself on weekends. Stubborn choice, slower than hiring it out, but mine. Clover is asleep on the couch. I have a project meeting tomorrow morning, a school campus in Evanston that I'm genuinely excited about, and plans to have dinner with my sister on Friday. My life looks, from the outside, like it looked before. Same job, different address, quieter evenings. But the internal texture of it is different. I spend less energy managing how I'm perceived, and more energy just being present in rooms. I catch myself talking about work at parties again, the full version, the actual details. And I notice that people are more interested than I'd been led to believe. I think about Dr. Okafor more than she probably realizes. Not just the gala moment, the whole 14 months of that project. She had treated me, every single time, like exactly what I was, the structural lead. No more, no less, with no adjustment for my age or my gender or anything else. She expected competence, and she got it, and she said so, cleanly, when it mattered. I didn't know how much I had needed that until it was offered publicly. I sent her a thank you note about a year after the divorce. Not about the gala specifically, just a note saying the oncology wing project had been one of the best of my career, and that her leadership through the process had made it better. She wrote back a short, warm reply saying she hoped we'd work together again. I hope so too. Brett Brett got remarried about 18 months after the divorce. I heard through a mutual friend. He seems, by all accounts, to be doing fine. I don't wish him anything bad. I genuinely don't. I think he loved me in the way he understood love, which was shaped and conditional, and always slightly tilted toward his own reflection. That's not nothing. It's just not enough, and I spent too long pretending it was. The hardest lesson from all of this wasn't about him, though. It was about me. It was about how I had slowly adjusted my volume in that relationship, how I had taken up less space, how I had started pre-editing myself, the way I talked about my work, the way I introduced myself, the things I offered and then pulled back. I had done some of that consciously, some of it without even noticing. And all of it added up to a version of myself that was smaller than the actual one. Recovering that isn't a single moment. It's not one ballroom reveal with a surgeon saying kind things while your husband stands there with nothing to say. That's a scene, not a solution. It's a long, quiet, unglamorous process of relearning what your own voice sounds like when nobody is editing it, of saying the full sentence instead of the shortened version, of letting people be bored if they're going to be bored, and staying curious about the ones who aren't. I've had first dates in the last year where I've talked about load calculations and structural retrofitting and the specific problem of vibration dampening in surgical suites, and I've watched the person across the table lean forward. That's not a small thing. That leans forward matters. Someone asked me recently what I would do differently if I could go back. I said, I would have talked. Not to prove something, not to win, just to talk. To say all the things I thought were too technical or too boring or too much, and see what happened. I would have taken up the space I was given and then some. I would have trusted that my voice belonged in the room, even in rooms that weren't built for it. I didn't say any of that to Brett, standing in that parking garage before the Gala. I just adjusted my bag and kept walking, but I know it now. And knowing it now counts. That's what I keep telling myself. Knowing it now counts. I thought a lot about what actually happened that night. Not the dramatic version, not the ballroom scene with Dr. Okafor walking toward me while Brett stood there with nothing to say. The quieter thing underneath it. What happened was simple, really. I had spent 2 years making myself smaller, and the truth had stayed the same size the entire time. That's the thing nobody tells you about silence. It doesn't erase what's real. It just delays the accounting. Brett spent 2 years editing me, softening my introductions, steering conversations away from my work, coaching me like I was a liability he was managing. And none of it changed a single thing about what I had actually built. The hospital wing was still there. The surgical suite I had fought for was still there, with its 18 extra inches of clearance, doing its quiet work every single day. You can manage someone's volume all you want. You cannot manage what they've already made. I used to think what happened to my marriage was about Brett, his insecurity, his need to be the most impressive person in any room, his particular brand of control dressed up as concern. And sure, those things were real, but sitting with it honestly over time, the part that cost me the most wasn't his behavior. It was my response to it. I chose again and again to shrink, not because I was forced to, because it felt easier, because I had decided somewhere along the way that keeping the peace was worth more than taking up space. That's on me. That's the thing I had to actually reckon with, not just in therapy but in the quieter moments after, when the story stopped being about him and started being about what I was willing to let happen to myself. The consequence of that choice wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. I became, over 2 years, less legible to myself. I stopped offering the full version of things. I pre-edited. I waited to see if interest was offered before I gave information. And all of that added up, not to a crisis, but to a kind of interior dimming that I hadn't noticed until something bright came along and I could see the contrast. Dr. Okafor was that contrast. Not because she rescued me, she didn't. And she wouldn't have framed it that way. She just treated me like what I was, plainly and without ceremony, in front of people whose approval my husband had been chasing for months. That's all it took for me to remember what it felt like to be seen accurately. What I understand now is that integrity works on a long timeline. The work you do, honestly, the standards you hold, the problems you solve carefully, All of that accumulates. It doesn't vanish because someone in your personal life has decided not to notice it. It sits there, solid, waiting. And eventually reality catches up with whatever story has been told about you, one way or another. Rachel learned that the hard way. And I think that's fine. Most real things are learned the hard way. The alternative, learning nothing, staying small, keeping the peace indefinitely, that's the worst outcome. I'm not smaller anymore. That's the whole story.